Chapter 10. Prince Arkin accompanied the Blessed south to the harbor city to meet the ship that King Rhaegan had sent for them. The southern portion of the Heartlands was a relatively safe area in the middle of the summer, as the raiders were all busy harvesting their own crops. There were almost no guards with them, and everyone was spread out over a few hundred meters. Selene was far behind the others, dawdling along on a bored boldness. Matilda and her father didn't notice since they were so far ahead, and engrossed in conversation. However, the others did notice. The four of them exchanged looks. "What's wrong?" Aubrey asked as she dropped back to ride beside Selene. "Well, my last family encounter involved an assassination attempt, and now we go walking into the lion's den like it's no big deal," Selene said, her hand involuntarily playing with her necklace. For a brief second, a flash of fear was in her eyes. Selene never showed fear. She hated seeming weak. The party started down a slope to the pier. After the bright green grasslands, the shock of the blue Salt River was a welcome sight. Aubrey had no memory of the family, but she reached over and covered Selene's hand with her own for a quick squeeze before the horses jostled apart. "I don't know your pain from family betrayal at all, but I promise you, Lady Nelina would never allow you to go someplace where she thought someone would hurt you." Selene glanced over at her, and Aubrey nodded firmly. "We will all protect you. Not to mention you were blessed. You could take care of yourself without any help of anyone else." Selene gave a soft smile for a few seconds before ducking her head down. She was still unsure, but at the end of the day, the only adult outside of her own retinue that she trusted was Nelina. The blessed she trusted, but it was because of the bond they shared. It struck her quite amusing that she could only be killed by the people she trusted most in this world. "We are with you," came the strong throb through the telepathic bond. It was powerful and held all the promise of friendship that wouldn't lapse. Selene looked up and smiled as they closed in, until she was surrounded by her people. She wasn't alone anymore. King Rhaegan had sent a large three-masted ship to pick up his niece. It was built with a stables under deck so the horses could accompany them across the Salt River. On the docks, Matilda calmed the horses. Belle was already ready for shipping, waiting patiently beside the large prairie cats. Selene dismounted from Boldness. He snorted and pawed at the ground, but stood completely still while she pulled her saddle and the bags off of him. He had attached to Matilda as animals do, but Selene had his true loyalty. He nudged at Selene as she pulled his bridle off to replace it with his halter. She offered him an apple from her pocket, and he happily bit it up. He blew out covering in her snot. She giggled at him and rubbed his forehead. "Okay, Boldy. As my future battle mount, you have to be able to travel well. This is the first test, so behave yourself," she told him, and he nibbled on her. War horses were trained to only take food from, and be handled by, their riders or trusted grooms. Then they couldn't be poisoned. As such, the sailors bowed out of the way as the Blessed led the horses up. Once the bags and trunks were loaded and both human and horse passengers were on board, the ship's captain approached them. "Princess Selene." She patted Boldness on the rump as he willingly followed Adeline's gelding, who was good at ignoring his antics, before turning to the man. I've come to accept Lady Selene, but please, I'm no princess. But how did you know who I was?" He bowed deeply. "I am Captain Hank, and I knew milady because you are identical to, and as beautiful as, your mother. This ship was named after your mother, and the crew of the Wild Rose are honored to escort you and your blessed companions to Dala." He motioned to the cabins. "I would like to show you to your cabins." The blessed and the retinue followed the captain as his crew prepared to set sail. My apologies to your company, Lady Selene," Captain Hank said, opening a cabin door, "but for the 2 nights about the ship we will be in rather crammed quarters. Are any of you opposed to sharing cabins? We have 3 available." "Oh, not at all. We're used to being around one another. Dibs and y'all," Selene responded, looking at the others. "I get Eblin," Matilda responded. Aubrey and Adeline merely laughed as they were together. Matilda stuck her tongue out at Selene before turning to the captain. "Now, Captain, I do not know if you were informed, but I have 2 prairie cats that'll be joining us on the trip. They're well behaved, but can alarm people. I'll take care of them during this trip, but I would suggest you inform your crew. I sent them off for a quick bathroom break before we set sail." Of course, your majesty. He bowed and left them to inform his crew of the new passengers and leaving them to settle into their sleeping arrangements. He also went to move the galley cook to the regular crew's sleeping area so that their retinues could have a place to sleep. So, are you excited to meet the sane members of your family? Niall asked from where he sprawled out on the bed, already with a book. Celine didn't bother to unpack any of her clothes. She had her training clothes in her pack, and that was all she needed overnight. Adeline had a gown stored in one of her multiple trunks for when they arrived in Dala. Uh, Nervous. My mother is a very proper lady, and I think they expect me to be like her. Celine flopped on the bed beside him, her legs on the headboard and her head down by the footboard. Well, they'll be disappointed then, he muttered into his book, and then squealed when she pinched the side of his stomach. Wench! He cried as he tossed his book to the side and grabbed a pillow, lobbing it at her head. With a war cry, the pillow fight began. The captain heard scuffling, but when he reached for the door, he heard a voice behind him. I would leave that alone. He turned and saw the girl with the long black hair smiling at him. Niall and Celine have a remarkably close friendship, and a very uniquely odd one. Whatever they're doing in there, you don't want to know. Aubrey's tone was dry, but full of humor. The captain hesitated and glanced at the door and back to her. Is this the young man whom she fancies? The girl shook her head. Oh no, just a very good friend. We all are like that in the blessed. It can be a lonely path, being cursed by the gods to fall in their path. Cursed. She glanced behind her into the open cabin where the Princess Adeline was unpacking. Quietly, she closed the door. Adeline could be sensitive to such truths. The weight of the world is upon us. We are the gods' mouthpieces, their instruments, their weapons. Whether or not we want to be. We have no option but to follow the path they have set for us. Does that sound like a blessing to you, Captain? She could easily read the confusion on his face, and a faint smile appeared back on her lips. I'll leave you with that thought now, Captain. She dipped her head and stepped back into her cabin. The captain remained quietly outside the doors, listening to the squeals and laughter inside the room before withdrawing. That night, the captain and his two first mates dined with the blessed. The conversation was rich with topics that could be considered advanced for people 10 years older. The blessed had a unique, fair outlook on life. They were charming and polite, and very well educated. The next day, the crew was surprised to see the princesses Mathilde and Adeline and Aubrey up at the crack of dawn training. Adeline was practicing with her bow and arrows on the rocking ship, giving her a new perspective to moving targets. Aubrey and Mathilde were practicing spear exercises. When Captain Hank walked up to the mast of his ship, he watched them curiously. Evelyn was using her magic to split the morning fog from in front of the ship. Her hands swung gently in the morning breeze, and the fog moved to her command. Good morning, Captain Hank. How are you this morning? Adeline asked him as she cocked another arrow in her bow. Good morning, Princess. I slept well. How about yourself? Oh, beautifully. It was like being lulled to sleep by the dream god. Adeline noticed the captain glancing around the deck and laughed. Celine and y'all won't be up for a few hours yet. If they don't have morning duties, they prefer to sleep late. It's why if we have to share rooms, they share because they stay together. The captain nodded suspiciously. He still wasn't too sure what to think of the princess and the young boy sleeping in a room. He didn't approve, but the princess's man, Fidelius, was not worried about it. Hank remembered Fidelius. His family had served throughout the times as loyal soldiers. Fidelius had been the youngest of the family, the natural choice to escort Princess Rosabelle to her new kingdom. Not to mention, Fidelius had volunteered to go with the princess. He had done his duty well, and the men of Dala were slightly in awe of the man who now stood observing the blessed as their weapon skills and corrected them as need be. They trained for another hour before Fidelius caught the eye of one of the men and nodded. That man separated himself from the others and walked down to the cabins. It wasn't long until there were shouts and screams that alarmed the sailors. However, no one else showed alarm at all. Fidelius, in fact, had a smile on his face, as did the others of their party as they watched Celine kicking and ferociously fighting the soldier who carried her over his shoulder and tossed her without ceremony onto the deck. The little fighter was on her feet instantly, as descending upon her was the soldiers that were with them. She blocked a blow and began to fight with legs and arms. She was a little fighting force, able to defend herself with no weapons until she had the others gasping on the ground. She finally stood straight, her shoulders straight back as she glared at them all. What a rude awakening! Honestly, Fidelis, you need to start using more of an element of surprise. Ooh, cool, can I steer? Fidelis laughed aloud. If you ask our captain nicely, perhaps you may, princess. However, I do believe you should change and eat first. Celine swung her head around to find Captain Hank, and she smiled sweetly at him. Can I please steer? The captain hesitated, bewildered at her changes of tone and personality and that sweetness. Hesitantly, he looked at Fidelis, who shrugged. I do believe you may, princess, but as your guardian says, after you have changed and eaten. Instantly, she scowled at him. My guardian still insists I be called princess. However, you will call me Lady Celine. The captain nodded, and she brightened before bounding away to change. As she went, the sullen boy staggered, moaning as if he hadn't slept long enough. It wasn't long before Fidelis had that one also doing spear exercises. Celine stepped up, excited, her long hair lazily and sloppily bound up, so it was out of her face. Captain Hank explained some beginner's skill in how to steer the wide river. In truth, the Salt River shouldn't even be called a river, as it was a division of the continents. It was the widest in the west by Lady Nelina's lands, narrowest in the middle before it opened wide again to the far south between the north and south desert kingdoms. From the harbor city of the Heartlands, they had to sail through the narrowest part of the Salt River, where, on a clear day, the Heartlands could see clearly the kingdom of Drela. Once through the mouth, it was smooth sailing as the river got wider. The captain of Dala was to the far northeast of Dala, where their own main harbor was nestled. There were smaller cities and villages along the river's edge. Celine's first time at the helm of a ship was amazing to her. She could see the water, feel the power of the ship as it sliced through the waves, and she sighed deeply. If she had been a boy, her father would have her sailing a ship at a much younger age. All her brothers were 8 when they first sailed upon ships. However, ladies didn't sail. Hank gently reclaimed the ship's wheel from her when he noticed them start to drift from its course, for despite her weapons training, being at the helm of a ship took more endurance than she currently had. Still, she asked many questions for quite a few minutes, until Fidelis reminded her that she had studies. Once the studies were complete, the Blessed watched the young sailors competing at scaling the rigging using only their arms. The Blessed were captivated by this, and several of them tried. Aubrey got the furthest, with Celine close behind. No one could get above 5 feet. Adeline stayed sitting and observing and laughing at their attempts. That night, they all bathed, though they had to share the fresh water. Celine preferred Adeline's gentle touch to brush her long, red hair, since she didn't have the patience for it. Their ladies' maids were used to this, as Adeline's soothing touch usually helped ease the troubles of others. Although they all fought often as young people would do, their laughter was deep, and the bonds were real. The next morning, they sailed into the port of the capital. The people lined the streets and the pier, whispering that it was a sign that the gods and goddesses were returning. The royal family would have rather Celine's location remain a secret, but they didn't have that kind of control over their people. Although Fidelis and Helen could wish that Celine would wear a gown, they knew she was most comfortable in her traditional garb. So she wore her traditional pants, a dress shirt, and a small weapons belt at her hips. She allowed Evelyn to do her hair, brushed off her face and tumbling down her back. Her own jewelry was the rose necklace from her uncle long ago. The others were dressed in their nicest clothing as they descended the docks of Dala. Whispers started as they appeared, faces somber, overwhelmed by the fanfare. Guards parted the crowds and they stepped into carriages to go out to the castle. Dala was a wonderful country, one that specialized in mining and fruits in their balmier climate. It was a rich country, and this was proven by the cobblestoned yard heading straight to the large courtyard. There was no large drawbridge or barricades. Clearly these royals had never been attacked in their own lands. When the carriage door opened, there was no one there to greet them. Celine glanced over at the Blessed and Fidelis and took a deep breath. Pushing her shoulders back, she stepped out of the carriage and walked with her head held high with a confidence that could beguile. The others exited after her in a more relaxed fashion. Celine entered the great hall first. The sight of the royal family almost made Celine falter, but she pressed onwards. These were people who could maybe be a family with her. She stopped several yards from the royal family with the others flanking her. Fidelis continued ahead of them, a few feet. The court herald was also a few feet ahead of the royal family. His Majesty King Regan, the second of his name, and Queen Oriana are pleased to present their children, Crown Prince Acacius, Princess Cora, Prince Marcos, and Princess Yvette. Each royal member, when spoke, nodded their heads in acknowledgment. The king's hair was fire red, his skin was ruddy, and his eyes a golden brown. His wife had skin of pale ivory, a rather large brow, and dark brown hair. Her eyes were blue, along with her eldest son. All the children had red hair except the eldest son, who was of brown hair, like his mother. Fidelius cleared his throat, then he sank into a deep bow. Your Majesties of Dala, I am honored to present you with the gods blessed Princess Adeline of Westholt, Niall, Aubrey, Evelyn, Crown Princess Matilde of the Heartlands, and Lady Celine, daughter of Queen Rosabelle. Each blessed gave a small dip of their head, but no one bowed or curtsied. Gods blessed, they bowed before only the divine. They stepped closer to one another, staring at the royals without even a blink. King Regan stood from his throne, walked past all his immediate family to stand in front of Celine. He was only a few inches taller than her, and he watched her silently for a moment. She held his gaze, unflinching. You look so like my sister. But you remind me in temperament of my aunt, the Princess Marin. She had demanded to learn how to fight alongside her brothers. My father, your grandfather, King Damon II refused to fight her in combat, for she had bested him too often. Celine smiled a genuine smile. Mother often told me I reminded her of an aunt. She never said the name, however. It's nice to know I don't get all my nature from my father. A chuckle echoed throughout the room at that. King Regan lifted a hand up and tentatively touched her cheek, and then smiled and pulled her into a hug. She was stiff at first, and then slightly softened. She cautiously brought her hands up and gave him a tentative hug back. He held her hand as he turned to bow to the other blessed. It is an honor to have you in our court. We hope your stay is a pleasant one. Please come to meet my family. With that, the court was able to move forward to mingle with the blessed. At dinner, King Regan sat Celine at his right, and they visited and chatted about her mother and her upbringing. It wasn't a formal dinner, but rather a relaxed one with the blessed and royal family. The conversation was light and full of interesting topics, but Regan couldn't keep his eyes from Celine. He had loved his sister deeply and missed her all the years she'd been gone. He hadn't wanted his father to send her so far off into such a drunkard of a man, but as a young lad he had been ignored. Rosabelle and Regan had sent so many letters back and forth over the years, and even now, he conversed with her often. In this home, Celine wouldn't be feared for her power. All in all, the king and queen seemed to be kind people who were completely motivated on the upcoming war. Dala had suffered greatly in the First God's War. The royalty had never forgotten that. The knowledge had been passed from father to son throughout the centuries. They had been waiting for the call, and now that it was here, they were ready for war. They were knowledgeable as a mortal could be in the ways of the gods. The royal children themselves were from the ages of 8 to 15. Adeline was chatting with the eldest of them, the Princess Cora, because Cora was betrothed to one of her older brothers, Senrid. Cora had never met her betrothed, only exchanged chaperoned letters with him, so had many questions. The oldest son and Crown Prince Acacius was only 2 years older than Celine, and they were chatting about their training. He was a handsome and charismatic young man. He was genuinely interested in visiting with all of them. The blessed were rumored to be powerful young people, but hidden from the world by their mentor, the even more mysterious Nilena. In the Heartlands, a kingdom full of believers of the supernatural, the blessed had been accepted without a question. Dala was much of the same. The servants of the castle couldn't stop watching the young ones, and the blessed, unused to it, were shy. Their own maids and soldiers reacted by quietly ensuring that the Dalan servants weren't allowed in their rooms. The few weeks flew by, and for once, Celine was able to be loved in a family setting. Her Aunt Oriana really became a true aunt figure, and understanding of it and her new feelings, Fidelis continued the training of the other blessed, allowing Celine to spend more of her time in the presence of the royal family. Celine was becoming very close with Acacius. They hunted together, trained together. The same went for Adeline, who spent most of her waking time with Princess Cora, talking to her about her future husband. But each night, everyone dined together and on many different feasts. The royal family took this time to speak of each of their guests' history, for Oriana had and Regan did believe to educate their family as much as possible. The night before the blessed were due to leave, they and the family retired to the sitting room to visit and have after dinner drinks. A game of cards was being set up and the conversation was light. Regan cleared his throat. We've had such a good time with your visit. You'll need to come back to visit us again soon. Thank you, King Regan. I can't wait for us to become family for real, Adeline replied first while holding Cora's hand and squeezing it. Well, of course you all need to come to the wedding, Cora told them, and they agreed. And it'll be easy for you all to get here on Celine's ship, King Regan said. Wait, what? Celine had been arguing with Acacius about training and not paying attention. Well, the last letter I received from your mother released her property to you. You see, my father loved his eldest daughter deeply. And when she voluntarily agreed to marry your father for peace, he wanted her to always have something to herself. So she is the heiress for a small estate nestled in the harbor of the valley. In her absence, it has made quite a bit of wine for the markets. I've kept that money set to the side for her since she has been gone. A trading merchant who was going bankrupt was selling 3 ships, so I bought his business from him in your name. Right now, the ships are finishing their last contracts, which will last until a few months before Cora's wedding next year. When you come back for the wedding, we can figure out who to hire to manage the company for you, and you can also visit the estates. There was silence, and Celine stared at him slack-jawed. She had no way to process the fact that she had gone from being a poor, disowned princess to owning several ships and having land. The queen began a round of soft applause. Bravo, my dear, you deserve it all. The queen smiled at her husband. The estate made a good deal for the crown in taxes, and this made sure that Princess Celine became a good friend of the crown, a blessed beholden to their kingdom. Celine stood up to hug her uncle, unable to speak. So, Celine, will you keep the name Wildrose? Regan asked her the next morning as they rowed down to the harbor to see her ships. She smiled as she looked at the 3-masted ship that was now hers, a glint in her eyes. Nay. I'll dock her in the harbor city and have her renamed to the Rosy Vengeance. She needs to be remodeled, too. The other ships will be used for business, but this one will be my personal ship. Nilina has been thinking about making a dock at the manor, and perhaps this will convince her to do it. I think that's a great name, my dear. He smiled proudly. She toured the boat again and discussed some changes with Captain Hank, mostly in the size of the cabins. She had told her uncle to keep the regular crews on the past contracts. He was also going to get her a list of possible candidates for manager before she came back next year. The Blessed spent the night on the ship so they could leave with the early tide. Celine, for once, was up in time with the sun, Captain Hank allowing her to steer once they were on the Salt River.